Namaste, everybody. Welcome to our November month online meet of the Chrysalis Anthal Forum. I'm sure markets must have given you the green signal. I've been in the market for the last few weeks continuously, and it's a pleasure to see people, entrepreneurs working and going all out with this slight window which they see in the market pre-Diwali. And I wish and I feel and I believe that this window continues for the rest of the months of this financial year, and wish you all great business. मैं जितना मार्केट में गया, जितना मैं लोगों से मिला, एंटरप्रेन्योर से मिला, this one question which has been doing the rounds time and again has been that the last 7-8 months which have been difficult, it has given time to our customers, to our clients to become more demanding, and now it's difficult to handle at times this client pressure. So what do we do? So just want to start off this evening by giving you some clarity on this front as to if you are handling a difficult customer, if you have a demanding customer, what do you do? और बहुत से entrepreneurs मुझे लगता है कि शायद इस situation से connect कर पा रहे होंगे. You might be able to resonate with this situation that you have a demanding and a difficult client in front of you. What do you do? Well, I believe personally I've been sharing this with everybody, and I want to share this with everybody here on social media also, that nothing much you can do with a demanding customer, because that's not in your control. How much demanding he would be, what level of difficulty he will bring in front of you is not in your control. So I feel that we should put all our energies in areas which are in control, and that's what wisdom says. That's what wise people would do. So you have to understand what are your areas which are in your control, and if you can focus your energies there. So I'll just give you a slight shift, which if you can have in relation to your business, a slight shift in the approach which you have, I think that can help you a bit in handling difficult customers. And this shift is about the way we do business. I feel business is as much as it is about having, it is also about becoming. So you want to have a certain turnover, you want to have a certain number of people should work for you, you want to have a certain market share, you want to have a certain presence in the world. And ये तो है ज़रूरी. I'm not saying this is not important, but along with having, if we can focus also on becoming, that as a business house or as an enterprise, as an entrepreneur, I want to become capable of manufacturing so and so kind of products. It's also about becoming capable of hiring certain number of people. It's also about business, also about becoming capable of adding on to the economy of the country, adding on to the GDP of the country. It's also about becoming an organization which is running on certain values and certain principles. So ये business जो है ये balance है of having and of becoming. And if as an entrepreneur we can balance both, I think then we are good to go. We have wonderful days ahead of us. And I feel that same thing which I share with youngsters who are about to take up a job somewhere in a company and they're about to pass out from a college. मैं हमेशा youngsters को यही बोलता हूँ कि the first 5-10 years of your professional life, you should look out for a company where you can become somebody, rather than becoming or rather than moving out of college with a thought process of having a good job, of having a good salary, of having some certain position, having a certain place where you can work. I think it should be more about becoming. वो company देखो, वो जगह देखो जहाँ तुम कुछ इन 5-10 सालों में कुछ बन जाओगे. Because what you have with you, maybe your money, your salary, your perks, your whatever it is there, this can be taken away. और हमने देखा है पिछले 7-8 महीनों में. So what people had as money, as turnovers, as jobs, it was taken away because of this pandemic. लेकिन जो आप बन जाते हो, what you become, can never be taken away from you. Everything can be taken away, but what you become will always remain with you. So if you can focus on this in the business side also, that you have something and you become something, इन दोनों का अगर combination लेके balance लेके चलते हो, तो I think you can move ahead in business in a better way. So ये approach को लेके अगर मैं इस question को answer करूँ, the question is how do I handle difficult customers? So I feel that if you focus on this part, that a difficult customer is a blessing in disguise. Because imagine करिए अगर आपके सारे customers जो होते, they would have been relaxed, they would have not been demanding, they would have been okay with whatever quality you gave, with whatever delivery schedules you had, if they were okay with whatever you were offering them, तो आप कितने ढीले पड़ जाते? If they were okay with any kind of service from your side, तो आप कहीं complacency में कुछ अपनी quality को गिरा देते, अपने SOPs को आप शायद भूल जाते. So a demanding customer is a blessing because he will or she will always keep you on your toes. तो मुझे लगता है कि एक demanding customer आपको कुछ बना देता है. So you look at your customer, a demanding customer from this perspective, कि वो आपको अनजाने अनजाने में कुछ बना रहा है, और जो आप बन जाओगे फिर आपसे वो कोई ले नहीं सकता, इफ यू कैन हैव दिस अप्रोच। और वैसे भी उसकी डिमांड के ऊपर हमारा कंट्रोल नहीं है, उस डिमांड से हम कुछ जो बन सकते हैं, दैट इज डेफिनेटली इन आवर कंट्रोल। सो आई सी दिस क्वेश्चन फ्रॉम दिस पर्सपेक्टिव। एंड सेकंड इज लॉट ऑफ पीपल दे से नहीं सर प्राइसिंग में खेलता है, प्राइसिंग कम कराता है। सी आई फील दैट योर कस्टमर्स नो मोर अबाउट योर बिजनेस देन यू नो। So you can't load your unhygienic way of doing business, the cost of that, on the customer. I was talking to one entrepreneur who is into manufacturing of garments and in the morning, and he says, I realized in the last few months that हम लोग जहाँ 4 लोग चाहिए, हम लोग 8 लोग लेके बैठे हुए थे. So definitely our cost of manufacturing was high. So if you are doing business in an unhygienic way, that cost of unhygienic way of doing business cannot be loaded on the customer. Why should the customer suffer because you did not work on your certain ways of doing business? So customers बहुत अलर्ट हो गए हैं, ये डिमांडिंग कस्टमर आपको बहुत कुछ सोचने पे लगाएंगे. So I think it's time to look into your size, into your own lives, in your own way of doing business, and आपको कुछ ना कुछ अच्छा रास्ता मिलेगा. So that's from my side for today, for to start off this evening, this wonderful evening of Crystal Santal Forum. And today for our monthly meet, we have the guest speaker, Mr. Achyut Godbole. I have had many profiles to speak on in the past. लेकिन जब मेरे पास गुडबोले सर की प्रोफाइल आई, it is one of the most distinguished profiles I've had, and it's an honor to read out his profile to all of you and to share that this amazing, awesome personality who's in front of us. And thank you, Rajesh, one more time. You got in touch with Mr. Godbole and you brought him on board on our platform here. Mr. Godbole, if you were to, I'm amazed by this one feat which he has. He's in his profile, it's mentioned that he has scored 100% marks in almost all the exams in mathematics from first standard to his IIT days. So even when he was doing his IIT in mathematics, he's got 100% marks in all the examinations. It's an awesome feat. A chemical engineer from IIT Mumbai way back in 1972. It's 2 years more than I was born. So I was 2 years of age. Godbole sir, jab aapne IIT clear kiya. So I'm just thinking from that perspective. And you look so young. In fact, even right now, the way you're, I can see you. It's awesome to see you so young. And मैं 50 का और आप अभी, you know. So with 32 years of experience in the software world, being there with the best of companies like Patni, Syntel, L&T. I made my career. I started my career in corporate training with Patni way back in 1999. And there you took Patni to heights which we knew of in the past. And as CEO, as MD, you know, of these companies. And apart from being in the corporate world, in the IT world for 32 years, having traveled more than 150 times abroad for you know, work in these companies, the awesome part is that you have written books. Godbole sir has written almost 33 books in Marathi and 4 books in on the technical side. In terms of operating systems, data communications, networks, web technologies, and it speaks about the kind of wealth he brings in today, this evening for all of us. In context with so many books he has written, 33 books in Marathi and 4 technical books, and the number of awards which he has received over the last so many years, the list is huge. And he's also a column writer for quite a few online and offline magazines, and with a keen interest in science, technology, mathematics, management, music, literature, arts, economics. It's a holistic approach to life which he brings on board. So I'm sure, not taking much of time, as he heads as MD of a software consulting company, you know, today he brings with us this wealth of knowledge. So let's have our pen, books, writing pads ready with us to listen to what Mr. Godbole has to share with all of us. So all over to you, sir, and the audience is waiting excited to listen to you.
Thanks a lot, first of all, you know, for very kind introduction. Let me just sort of say a few words in the beginning. I mean, you know, I had decided to speak about what the future has in store for us in terms of technology, in terms of business, and the business models that will emerge in times to come. But as you had suggested, I'll probably spend a few minutes to talk about my experiences. So more importantly, some management principles, if I may call them so, you know, in terms of how I managed to grow these companies. I mean, I was head of Patni after Narayan Murthy left Patni. I sat in the same chair and ran Patni for 11 years. And then I was a managing director of Sintel for 4 years, and then CEO of L&T Infotech for 4 years. And then some years in Apar as the CEO and so on. So I think all of these companies when I joined were fairly small, and when I left they were reasonably big. Thousands of software professionals all over the globe, with 6 offices in the US and 4 offices in Europe and 2 in Japan and 2 in Australia, and that kind of empire, software empire. I think it was great fun running that kind of empire. After IIT, I would like to sort of go into the sort of my autobiography. There's a book called Musafir, which is very popular amongst Marathi readers. I won't go into how I actually went into Adivasis, and then also actually went to Satyagraha, and then went to jail for 10 days, and then came back and was jobless for a year, and stuff like that. And then I started my career with on IBM machines, by the way. In fact, I was with IBM, and then my actually growth really started with Patni. And then for 23 years, I was a CEO or managing director of large software companies, and that's the experience that I had. I mean, I've never been an entrepreneur in the sense that I've never owned a company, but I've run companies as if I own them. I mean, that's very important. A CEO actually has to behave as if he owns the company. I mean, that's very important. But what were the management principles that actually, so I would like to sort of run through some principles. It's not just my experience, but also a few management principles that we all should remember. And I understand there are in the group, there are some individual entrepreneurs, there are some small scale industries, and there are some medium scale industries, I guess. And the kind of things that I'm going to talk about are valid for just about any industry. My experience, by the way, has been basically in team building. The so-called success is actually was based on my teamwork. It was not my individual success. Basically because I could build teams. It was very important that I could actually recruit, hire, motivate, and build teams. I mean, I think that was very, very important. I think all the people who are running, companies or factories or whatever, the most important part is people and motivation. How do you hire? How do you motivate? And that kind of thing. So let me just sort of put some PPTs and okay. So thanks a lot again. And what I would like to go through is some basic principles of any management. I mean, it's very important for us to I used to divide management at 3 levels. One is personal management, operational management, and strategic management. Personal management is time management, how to keep meetings, and first things first as is very important principle, as we know. And personal discipline, like to-do list and what we need to achieve today, tomorrow, this week, and so on. So I think making those lists and actually making sure that we have that kind of personal management is very important. But I think the second is operational management. In factories, for instance, there's material management. We used to have bill of material and MRP and so on. Or production and operations management, which actually has routing and capacity requirement planning and so on. Or accounts, finance, admin, sales management, and project management, which is very important. In software business or any business, in fact, project management is very important. And most of the times, projects fail because of certain reasons. So I'll actually go through those reasons a little later. But there is the third one is strategic management. As I have said, there are 3 levels. One is personal, second is operational, and third is management. And third is strategic. Now, strategic management actually, the first element of strategic management actually was started by Peter Drucker between 1960s and 70s when he stated the principle of management by objectives. So you want to set your objectives first, what you want to do, and then delegate. Essentially, Peter Drucker, thought about delegating the activities to various managers. And then you had vertical and horizontal integration. I think, until 1980s, there was a theme of vertical integration. What is vertical integration? Vertical integration essentially means that you produce whatever your sub components or parts that go into your manufacturing, you yourself manufacture those. And it's typically a middle class kind of mentality. Essentially a car manufacturer thinks, why should I outsource my tire manufacturing to another company? Because the company which is manufacturing tires is also making some profits. So if I manufacture the tires also, then I'll save that profit and I can make that profit myself. So that was the idea. That was the concept. And that is vertical integration. So the car manufacturer also manufactures tires, also manufactures upholstery in the car, also manufactures the electronics, that is tape recorders, the CD players, whatever, or wipers and things like that. So essentially, you manufacture everything that you need. This was the philosophy until 1980s. And then came Michael Porter, and he laid out the principle of core competencies. I think it's very important for us to understand what he really said. And we used to, this has had an enormous amount of impact on the entire industry and business models. What he said was, you should not manufacture everything. You decide what you're best at. If you want to decide the car engines, then you make sure that you are the best car manufacturer of car engines in the world, or maybe in the first three. As Jack Welch of GE always used to say, you better be in the first 3 or maximum 5 in the world of whatever you do. Otherwise, you should quit that business. So I think it is very important that you decide what you want to do, focus on what you want to do, and then outsource the rest. Please understand, this is important. Outsource the rest to companies who are specializing in those. So the company which is specializing in manufacturing wipers, you outsource manufacturing of wipers to them. Tires to tire manufacturing companies, and so on and so forth. I think it was a very, very important principle in 1980s. Actually, it originated, from Ricardo's principle of comparative cost theory, frankly, where he actually said that each country should produce what the country is best at and then trade. And that's how he built his theory of trade, Ricardo, back a few centuries back. And then, in fact, globalization is, in economics is based on the same principle, that you should not manufacture everything. The self-reliance is something that says that you should manufacture everything by yourself, whereas globalization says that you should manufacture what you're best at, and then each country does that and then trades. And that's how the whole economy grows. That's the basic principle of globalization. Now, Michael Porter talked about countries and also companies, and he brought the principle to companies. And he said each company also should focus on what you are best at. And that's where the principle of core competency came into existence. The entire IT industry of India, or in fact the entire Chinese manufacturing, is based on this. Because from 1980s, outsourcing business grew thanks to this principle. So General Electric, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, most of these companies started focusing on their core businesses. Ford Motors said that or Chrysler said that my business is car manufacturing. Why should I have 1,000 software programmers? I should outsource my software business to somewhere else. And then they started outsourcing to American companies, which was very expensive, because American programmers used to cost $100 per hour. And that's where Indian companies, TCS and Patni at that time, we used to go to New York and then give presentations that we can do the same job cheap, in a more sort of inexpensive fashion and so on. So that's how Indian IT industry grew, thanks to this. So it has had an enormous impact throughout the world. It created islands of excellences. For instance, China became the manufacturing hub, India became the services hub, IT, banking, and so on and so forth. So I think and this is what we mean by strategic management. So it is not basically just running your operation on a day-to-day basis, which is what operations management is. Personal management talks about how you should manage your day and week and calendar and timeliness and keeping notes at the end of the meeting and so on and so forth, how to conduct meeting. And I don't need to sort of preach you on that. The point is, in 1980s, core competencies arose, and then there was a fierce competition. Thanks to many companies, competing. And then there was an emergence in 1990s of customer relationship management, CRM, supply chain management, and then JIT. In 1972, in fact, JIT arose in Toyota in Japan. And JIT essentially says, and I don't need to sort of explain that because we don't have time, but essentially, what you're doing is reduce the inventory, your stock. Okay, by if you just stock something, you're wasting your money. Because there's also a cost of capital because the interest is lost. So why unnecessarily carry that inventory? And there are multiple ways to reduce the inventory. There are inventory control mechanisms, reorder levels, and so on, which are classical mechanisms, and MRP, etc., which are the latest mechanisms, where there's a bill of material and so on and so forth, especially in job-oriented manufacturing systems. So I think it is very, the JIT just in time says that when you require an item at the in your workshop, normally you stock your item in the stores and issue that item to the workshop when something has to be manufactured using that object. But instead of storing it and then issuing it to the workshop, if JIT really envisages, by the way, from the supplier, the material directly coming to the workshop at the time that is required, just in time. So you almost carry no inventory. From supplier, the material directly comes. And at that time, 1972, in Toyota, they tried to implement it without too much of success. But now, with a huge amount of, and I'll talk about that, Industry 4.0, which started in Germany in 2011, we are really talking about a huge digital infrastructure of suppliers on the one hand, your customers on the other hand, and your company, and the very seamless kind of digital interface where JIT is becoming possible. And I'll come to that. Then ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning, we were aware of Oracle and SAP and so on and so on. They all arose and grew in 1990s. And we all used to, in fact, go to Oracles and SAPs. I've been to Waldorf, the Germany's SAP's headquarters several times. The last one, which has 2000 onwards, the most important strategic management principle which has arisen is innovate or die. So you must continuously change, innovate, and that's the theme that I want to really talk about in my later this. Now I'll only talk about. I can really talk about this for 3-4 hours, but I think let me just sort of catch the entire essence of why projects fail. Now here I'm talking about operations, about personal, operational, and strategic. I've already divided, but in operations management, a project is a project, okay? And there are many reasons why normally projects fail. One of the reasons is aim is not very clear as to why you want to do that project. And there's business analysis, especially in IT businesses. And I'm sure that actually holds true for most of the other businesses as well. But in IT, the company does not understand the business of the customer. So if I'm doing a project for a customer, I don't understand the business. So essentially, we used to say that IT people talk in terms of bits and bytes, and business people speak in terms of debits and credits, and that's where the businesses fail. The IT people need to understand the business, and the business people need to understand IT, at least the limitations or capabilities of IT, and that doesn't happen quite often, and therefore the projects fail. Estimation, that is very important. If you want to do a task, for instance, you need to estimate how long it's going to take to do that task. In the early mass production era, Frederick Taylor actually had the time and motion studies and so on and so forth, and I won't like to go into that. And that is, essentially to calculate the time that it takes to perform a particular task, including on lathe or whatever. And that was at that time called as time and motion studies. But essentially, you need to estimate whether you're having a building, for instance, and there are each project is divided in multiple milestones, or milestones divided in tasks. I'll give you an example. If I'm building 4 towers, a project consists of 4 towers, and a milestone is 1 tower, and each floor may be a task, for instance. So you can divide, or any level, for any levels you can conjecture, you can think about, and divide project into milestones and tasks. And for each task, then you have to estimate just what time it is going to take and what material is going to be required. For instance, if you want to complete 1 floor of a building, what material will be required, and what kind of people will be required, how long. Now, while you do that, you have to assume an average person. You can't assume the best person, because all your people are not the best. And if you assume the best person and do that estimation, your project will not be completed in time. If you assume the worst person, You obviously will give target date to the customer, which is very lax, very, very good for you. But then the customer will obviously tell you that the project is going to end only much later, and he'll probably go to some other supplier. Similarly, you have to talk about whether the activity can be done parallelly. One can be split and done by many people. Then there are dependencies or not, the CPM, PERT, and so on. After taking that into account, you have to prepare a project plan, and then staffing. And I'll spend a little while on staffing, because that's where I used to actually spend a lot of time. How do you recruit people, or how do you staff people? By staffing, I mean allocating the existing people to a particular project. How do you do that? So first of all, you need to make sure that these are technically capable people. In building construction, I would essentially say that architects, whether they know architecture very well or not, civil engineers are well qualified or not, and plumbers and electricians, are they well qualified or not? So first is, are they good enough? Two is, and that is quite often neglected or overlooked, I think it's very important, is teamwork. Are they capable of doing teamwork, or are they egoistic or egotistic, or they're loners? Can they sort of enthuse other people? Can they solicit the cooperation from people? I think it's very important. But when we used to recruit people, there used to be 6-7 people, trainees or whatever, and we used to put them in a conference hall, and then give a topic for discussion. So group discussion, we used to call it. So all the 6, 7, 8, whatever number of people used to start discussing. I used to give a topic, and they used to start discussing. Some people used to be very aggressive, and then used to dominate the discussion. And on the other hand, some people used to keep silent almost all through the discussion, and they didn't speak at all. There were a few people who would listen to the arguments of all, then make the conclusions and put the conclusions very coherently, very cogently, and very emphatically. But good listener, being a good listener and being a team player is very important. And we used to actually look for those qualities during the group discussions that we used to have before selection. Then the level is very important. What I had a principle, please understand, this is very important, especially for large companies. And if you are building a company which is going to be large, please remember this principle. I had actually implemented this principle. But what I used to do is, normally, when people who report to you, normally they do not recruit. I mean, this is human nature. There are obviously exceptions, and I wish there were many more exceptions. But quite a few times, they don't recruit people under them who are very capable, because they fear that they will take their place. So if I'm, let's say, vice president or senior vice president, and I'm hiring a vice president, if I hire a very sharp vice president, and I fear that in 6 months' time, 1 year's time, he will be smarter than me, and then he will actually take my place, or will at least pose a challenge to me, I would rather have somebody who will do that work, barely, maybe, do that work, because I can't afford to recruit somebody who is completely inefficient, because I'll be exposed. So I have to recruit somebody who can complete that job, but just barely, but will not be smart enough to replace me. And I think that's the death knell of a company, because you are actually creating a mediocre company. So what I used to do is, just one level below, when I was the CEO and my senior VP used to hire people under him or her, I used to be present for that interview to make sure that the person who he or she is rejecting is actually worth rejecting, and not the person is not rejected because of this fear. So one level, I used to call it one level principle. So I used to because I can't be present for all the interviews, but I used to be present for interviews which were conducted by just my next level people, make sure that good people are hired and this fear factor is done away with. And I used to actually make sure that my senior VPs are taken care of. So I used to talk to them and make sure that they are not threatened. And then senior VPs used to sit in the interviews when VPs used to conduct interviews for senior project managers. So I think this probably goes for 2-3 levels. How to build a good company. I mean, this is very important, that if you want to get out of this mediocrity and want to build a very high class company, make sure that you are participating in interviews just one level below. And then look at the potential. That is very important. You don't look at the current, most of the software companies, I mean, I've done that mistake myself also. I mean, by the way, all this I'm saying, I'm not saying that I've not committed mistakes. I've committed several mistakes. It's just a question of learning from the mistakes. So I'm just telling you what we should do. So we should look at the potential of what the person is likely to achieve. And very, very important. Because you need 40 Java programmers. So you basically just hire 40 Java programmers to complete a particular project, but maybe 20 of them cannot grow or outgrow their potential of just being Java programmers. They'll continue to be Java I've seen in my life many people joining as programmers, and after 30 years they just become programmers or senior programmers. I've seen that many places. So you have to select people whether they are their potential to grow than only the current requirement. I think that's very important. How to build a good company. I think I'm just sort of then training. Training is very important. The next is work allocation. Work allocation is extremely important. What I used to do is, I'll give you an example. If there is shall I say, the level of a person, the ability of a person, 1 to 10, 10 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. If I feel that the person's ability is, let's say, 9, so he's really very good, but the requirement of the job is of a level 5. A person of level 5 also can do that job. But if I give that job to a person whose ability is of level 9, then we feel, typically the wrong feeling is that the person with 9 ability will be very happy because it will be child's play. I mean, it will be extremely easy for that person. If you give 4 days for a task to be finished, he'll probably finish in 3 days and maybe while away the time, and he'll be very happy because he's been given a very easy job. But that is not true, please understand. Because people like challenges. People like to learn from whatever they do. They want to enjoy what they do. They want to be challenged all the time. And I think it is very important, therefore, that if for instance, the person's ability is 7 and the task requires 7.5, I would give that 7.5 to a person whose ability is 7.25 or something. So give the task which is appropriate for the person, but a little higher. So if the person's capability is 7, give a task of 7.25 or 7.5, so that the person is stretched, person learns, person struggles, but in that process the company grows, because then you have a person of 7.5 capability later on. And that's how people grow from 6 to 6.5 to 7, 7.5 to 8, etc. So you are essentially coaching them. So the task allocation, work allocation, people don't take very seriously. They just throw the work, okay, you do this, etc. Especially at the higher levels. At higher levels, it is very important of how you allocate your task. I mean, I can give you an example of Mr. Premji of Wipro, and I've seen him in planes. He used to just sit with the laptop, and his company had maybe, a lack of people or whatever, but he used to sit with 100 people, somebody head of US, somebody head of Europe, somebody head of important project, 100 most important people in his company. And I'm sure that he was thinking about what each person would be doing in the next year, next 2 years, next 5 years and so on. If you control and plan and train and motivate those 100 people, you have done your job. Then you don't need to worry about the remaining 1 lakh people. Some will go, some will come, etc. But I think this is the most important thing, that how do you allocate work? And then that essentially comes from target setting. So as I've said, you set your targets, okay, of 7.5 for a person whose ability is 7. By ability, I mean knowledge of Java, knowledge of C, whatever that may be. But the current of that category, so that the person struggles, person is challenged, and once that job is done, the person actually is very happy, rather than giving a task of which requires a capability of 5 to a person whose capability is 9. That is wrong, because you're actually motivating that person and not utilizing the entire potential. The next is motivation, and I'll probably stop at this, because I can go on about management principles and what I did. That'll be a very long session. But I talk about motivation. I think while people are doing that work or doing the jobs, it is extremely important to communicate. Now, please understand that I'm talking from my experience of running large companies, but most of these principles of people management and recruiting and work allocation and teamwork and motivation are valid even if you have a 5 people company or 10 people company or 20 or 100. I think if you really want to grow, most of these principles, if you inculcate and start implementing right from the beginning, you're almost sure to be on the right path. So I think it's very important to understand. What I used to do is communicate, encourage. If somebody does a good job, pat on the back is extremely important. The next important thing is know your employees. And I must recommend a book to you from the name of the author is Max De Pree. And the name of the book is Leadership is an Art. He had a company of $2 billion or something like that. I think furniture or some manufacturing company, billionaire, is a big company. And the book actually is only 150 pages or something. I don't remember now. I've read it a long time back. But I think what he used to, he actually opens up saying that John, or I don't remember the name, and he was a foreman. And long years ago, when he started the company, John was also with him as maybe the first employee or whatever. And then John died. When John died, he paid a visit to his family, to pay condolences. And then when he went to his house, he found that there was a guitar on the wall. And he said, "What is this guitar doing?" The wife said, "Oh, didn't you know John used to play guitar so well?" And then he said, "Oh my God, I worked with John for such a long time. I didn't even know that he was a good guitar player." And then he started, the whole book describes about knowing your employees, how it actually makes such a large difference. If you have 100,000 people, like in Wipro, Infosys, it's very hard to know everybody. Or even when I was a CEO of maybe a few thousand employees, at that time it was very large, by the way. It was in India's first 5 or 10. But even then, if you have, let's say, a few thousand employees, it's very hard to know each. But it's very important to know the key people at least. Okay. And even their personal lives, their likes, dislikes. I'll give you an example of MBWA, that is management by walk around. Again, this is useful for larger companies. For smaller companies, 5 10 people, you must be talking to them every day. But when I had offices in Chennai and Pune and Bombay and even abroad, what I used to do is, whichever office I used to visit, I used to just make sure that for half an hour to 1 hour, I used to take a round, on the, I won't say shop floor, but my software group. So basically, this is I just wanted to talk about MBWA, management by walk around. What I had done, I remember I had gone to the US and I was coming back from the US and by KLM, from Detroit to Mumbai by KLM flight, and I was at the Schiphol airport at Amsterdam. And I met a guy who said, "Mr. Goodbole, do you remember I used to work for you?" And I said, "Yeah, vaguely remember." I used to, I didn't remember exactly. Maybe I remember his first name but not last, and so on and so on. And then he actually narrated a story. We had some time before the next flight. And he said that, I just wanted to tell you a story. And he said, "I'm from Bangalore. And I had actually joined you in Siebes in Sintel when you were a managing director, long years ago." And he said that I was lost because I was feeling very homesick. At that time, Bangalore had not developed as an IT hub. At that time, Mumbai Siebes was the main hub from which it actually, started and then went out to Pune, Bangalore, and other states. And he said, I was lost and I was in a project, and the project manager didn't used to speak to me for quite a long time. And then you were a managing director, and then you came once, and then you started talking to me. And then you asked me where I was from, so I told you that I hail from Bangalore. And then you inquired about my family, and I said I have a sister who's interested in classical music. And then which classical music? And he said Karnataka classical music. And then I asked him about Lalgudi Jayaraman and Subba Lakshmi and various people. So he was very thrilled that there's somebody, and not just somebody, but the managing director who directly is talking to him about music and about his interests and how his family is and so on. He felt very quite at home. And then at the Schiphol airport, he told me that he had the resignation letter ready in his pocket. And when I spoke to him, and then of course after 15 days, I again sort of took a round and talked to him for a couple of minutes, 5 minutes, and he inquired about his family, about his project, and so on. And then he said, I tore off that resignation letter, stuck to the company for 3 more years. And then obviously after a few years, then the green notes, that is dollars, attraction never can counter. And then he migrated to America, and then he told me that he was then at Philadelphia or whichever place. But he said, and then I realized that without knowing its impact or effect, the kind of things that I had I was doing. I had not read Pascal, or I had not read Tom Peters' book, but it's just that I liked meeting people. I like encouraging people. I like humor. I like music. I like jokes. I like food. And I think it's very important for us to understand and meet and motivate, and that plays a huge role. I mean, we don't realize that, because just sort of go to the office with frowning face and very angry face and all the time sort of not being approachable is not something which people like. And I think it's very important for us to be approachable, connecting with people, and so on and so forth. So I think that has played a very important role. Now I'll stop here, because in terms of marketing and the challenges that we faced in Japan and challenges we faced in Australia, where rates were very low. For each one, I can speak for an hour, I guess. But I think the most important part that I want to cover, because with the paucity of time, is I think what is the mantra that I want to leave you with, and that is innovate or die. Because the times that we're going to face in the next, I would say even 5, 10, 20 years. Earlier I used to say 50 years, 100 years, but now the things are changing so rapidly, that in the next 20 years or so, the world is going to change entirely. I mean, and only those companies who can adapt, who can change, who can innovate will survive, and the rest will die, and literally die. And I think that is because we're talking about Industry 4.0, which started in 2011, is taking a great shape. And because of COVID, in fact, I must tell you that especially the United States is now thinking that why should I outsource things to China and India? Because then, as the China and America, there's a trade war, and I have to depend upon the supply chains, which are now very heavily dependent on China, then maybe South Korea, maybe Vietnam, Bangladesh, and maybe India. Why don't I do the work in America? One of the things that people actually outsourced the work to other countries for was cost. And then if artificial intelligence or Industry 4.0 is going to be the solution, if I can do most of the work almost without people or with minimal people, then I can reduce the cost and reduce the dependency. And that's why I really truly believe that, especially after COVID and after the US-China trade war, which actually aggravated after 2010, which is when America started realizing the Chinese power, so to say, the superpower. And then they felt threatened that they will not be number one. As you know, today China has surpassed the US in terms of GDP. So that's when the threat really started. And then they started thinking about this. I believe in the next 10, 20 years, and that's going to pose enormous amount of challenges, because a lot of work that gets outsourced to quite a few other countries from Europe, Japan, and America will be done in their own soil in the next 20, 30 years. A lot of it, not all, but a lot of it. And that's going to have an enormous impact. So I just want to sort of leave you with overall kind of picture. But essentially, unless you innovate or change or adapt, you are going to die. And I have several examples that probably run through another hour, but I will, finish this in the next 30 minutes. It's important. The technology or technological disruptions. The universe started 14 billion years ago, according to Big Bang theory. And then Earth, 4.5 billion years ago, and the first living being came into existence 3.75 billion years ago. Human history spans 100,000 years. Out of that, tens of thousands of years was agriculture, when there was no change in the way that we lived because there was no technology. Then there was industrial revolution in late 17th century, and only a few centuries of industrial revolution, the kind of change that we encountered, we saw, we experienced, the kind of change was much higher than the change that happened or improvement or technological change in tens of thousands of years of agriculture. And then services started only a few decades ago, from 1960s onward. And the change that happened in the few decades was much larger than the change that happened in the few centuries preceding those decades, which in turn was much higher than tens of thousands of agriculture. So I think those who understand mathematics, we're talking about d2i by dx2. I mean, it's not just sort of rate of change, the rate of change. The change is so fast today that the technological progress that we made in the last 10 years is much higher than the technological progress that we made in the entire history of mankind. So I think that's very important. It's not because we have become wiser or more intelligent suddenly. It's because we're standing on the shoulders of our predecessors, like Newton used to say. Newton stood on the shoulders of Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and so on. And similarly, we are standing on the shoulders of hundreds and thousands of scientists and technologists today, which actually have done enormous amount of work, which is why the rate of change is so high. Now, in terms of IT, 60s was mainframe, 70s was mini computers, 80s was PCs, 90s was internet, and 2000 onwards was mobile computing and technological convergence. What does technological convergence mean? Computer, television, and mobile are now merging together. On mobile, you can actually use as a computer, as you can do your word processing, you can do your computation, you can check your mails, whatever. So we can also speak on the mobile. You can see the television programs on the mobile. You can see your serials on mobile. So the technological convergence has happened. Now, 25 years ago, we didn't have an email address. 25 years ago, we didn't have mobile phones. 15 years ago, we didn't have a Facebook account. Smartphones today are more powerful than 100 desktops of 90s. And you cannot exist without any of these. Batteries are very fast, as you know. I won't like to go into that. And 2009, petaflop computers, 10 to the power 15 calculations per second. 2019, the zetaflop, 10 to the power 21 calculations per second. I mean, this is just enormous. What is likely to happen in tomorrow's world? Each one will have computers, mobile, and constantly connected. All of us, millions and people will be constantly connected. We're already living in that world, but of course, each one doesn't have a computer, each one doesn't have a smartphone today. And there are many poorer people in the world who don't have enough to eat, so forget about smartphones. But I think in 20 years' time, when each one will have computers and their smartphones and they'll be connected all the time, it's going to be a different world. Then video calls, as you know, but it's not just video calls. The next is important. Offices, banks, insurance, schools, colleges, buildings will become museums, because teleworking will become very common. Today, because of COVID, we are forced to do that. Many people are not liking it because of the bandwidth, and even e-education, distance learning. People are not liking it because they were not used to it. There's not enough textbooks and videos and, PPTs, and teachers are not trained. The poor people don't have enough smartphones. There's no bandwidth and so on. So I think, I won't say today e-learning in India is very successful. There are many hurdles. But in 20 years from now, 10 years from now, when most of the people have smartphones and bandwidth is very large, and hopefully we have 5G and so on, that will change the entire picture. And then you don't need to go to work. When I go to the office and take a decision, I call the secretary, and the secretary calls 4 managers, north, east, south, west, and then in a conference room we all sit and they give presentations about their sales, and then we have discussions about why the sales are down and so on. We don't need to do that. We're sitting in our respective homes. In front of each of us, there's a camera and a screen. The screen at the center, I'm depicted. I'm thrown. My video is at the center, and there are 4 corners where the four managers speak. Like you see on the television. 15 years ago, when I used to speak about this, people used to disbelieve me. But today on the television, every minute there are 6 people speaking from different locations. So my managers can be speaking from different locations. I don't need to be actually traveling. In fact, I have several books about death of distance. So it's very important that offices, banks, why do you need to go to the bank? I apply for loan through email. It is all documents can be emailed. My loan can be sanctioned. Money can be transferred through electronically. Why do I need to? Why does the building exist? Why do people need to go to the bank, or even insurance, or even school, or even college, and things like that? So I think this is not going to take 50 years. This you will probably see that in the next 20, 30 years. Remote factories run by robots. Notes, checks, credit, debit cards will soon become obsolete. Only e-transaction. This, in fact, you must go through Nandan Nilekani's. You know Nandan Nilekani, obviously, Infosys. He has a good lecture on the future of financial services. I'm sure it must be on the YouTube. Go through that. And I used to talk about this in several of my lectures. I used to give this around 20, 30 years to happen. He says in the next 10 years this is likely to happen. With Paytm, people now realize that you don't really need notes and checkbooks and debit card, all that. So credit card, debit cards, checkbooks and notes will completely vanish. Your bank balance will be on mobile. When you work through remote, the bank balance will increase. When you spend, you can also spend it through e-transactions and so on. So the whole world is going to change. The entire body will have many chips, and the chips will be on several places, by the way. There will be sensors and cameras on your body and to control temperature, BP, nano robots, it will be in your bloodstream. And all these experiments are going on, by the way, not in California, not just in California, but worldwide. I mean, this is not something just a dream or futuristic science fiction that I'm talking about. So nano robots in the bloodstream will continuously flow and monitor not just heart rate and BP and your liver functions and kidney functions and so on. And if there is a problem, they'll raise an alarm, give an indication to you, and directly give an alarm to your doctor, maybe a hospital, and maybe even call an ambulance. I mean, there's a huge kind of things that are going on. And there are some interesting things also, like there'll be videos. For instance, I'm sure you must have heard about Google Glass. Google Glass is an instrument, it's like a spectacle, but different kind of spectacle. But there'll be a chip in the glass, and then it can do translations. For instance, somebody is speaking to me in Kannada, it can hear, it can translate, and then I will hear the same conversation in Marathi or Hindi or English. If I look at, let's say, Taj Mahal, it'll take a picture of that Taj Mahal, and the Google Glass will search through Google and show me the information and history of Taj Mahal. If I'm looking at the restaurant, it'll pick up the picture and the name of the restaurant, pick up the Google, etc., and also its menu. It'll tell me what menu. If there's a hotel, then tell me what rooms are vacant, what are the rates, and so on and so forth. If I meet a person, I don't need to remember the name, because immediately the photo will be taken, and through a search of hundreds of photos who I have met in my life, it actually find out and throw the name and what was the last time that I had met him, that kind of stuff. So I think, because many times you meet somebody and don't remember the name, and it's a very awkward situation. The Google Glass is still in the testing phase, but it is almost certain that such a thing will exist in tomorrow's world. There will be advertisements on clothes, because there will be video cameras or the chips on your shirts and so on, and they'll be running advertisements while you walk, like Coca-Cola and so on. And Coca-Cola will pay you for running those advertisements, or the shirts with chips running those advertisements. The video will be on visiting cards. That is trivial, I think. In fact, photographs are now on the visiting cards. That's a good idea, because quite a few times you don't remember the name, associate the name. Now videos will be there. Videos will be there on demos of food packets. So on the food packets, for instance, there'll be, so just click like your QR code, and then immediately there'll be videos to how should you prepare those noodles or whatever. Newspapers will be with videos, with chips. So you just click that. If there's a war, then it'll actually show you the actual video of the war or a cricket game and so on. It won't be just a dry news of Sachin Tendulkar scored so many runs. It'll actually be a video. So then there'll be personalized newspaper and so on. I don't have time to speak about that. Paperless office, all books and libraries will be digital, so they will be in museums. All libraries will be in museums. Universal translators, robots will perform household works and so on. Now, biotechnology, I have Human Genome Project, artificial insulin, and we can conquer AIDS. The brain will actually understand your feelings and what you want to do, and give instructions to your muscles, and that will be very useful for the paralytic patients. So I think it's very important. Stem cells to generate any organ, medicines to change mood, behavior, etc. Then nanotechnology will be, nanotechnology had a great promise. Actually, it was put forward by Richard Feynman, the great physicist, but it took several decades for it to take shape and come of age. But now, I think in the next 20, 30 years, nanotechnology is going to play havoc. I'm sure nanoparticles are being used at several places. But it will revolutionize food, clothes, housing, appliances, entertainment, cosmetics, energy. Car color will change with speed. TV made of graphene will be foldable and portable. As it is mobile, Samsung has come up with portable mobile, as you must have known. Shoe surface will change as per the color of the thing. Clothes that will never get dirty or wet. Nano suits will, with watch, camera, recorder, mobile, you can see from behind, by the way. With nano suit, there will be cameras and there will be angles, so that you know what's happening behind you. I mean, that will be very interesting. Reversible biotaste. There's all kinds of things that I don't have time to sort of talk about, but nanotechnology is going to be extremely important. Travel trains with 4 and 5 kilometers per hour, driverless cars, that is now absolutely becoming reality. As you know, and that the deep learning of artificial intelligence is playing a great role in that, by the way. And again, we won't have time to do that. Cars without accident. If the car actually, goes near an object, the sensors will sense it and automatically put the brake. So then there are 500 stories building. There was a project which was envisaged in Houston, was put aside after 9/11. Underwater cities, there's a corporation, Taisei Corporation in Japan, which actually was thinking of underwater cities because shortage of land. Then NASA has a plan of having a population. People actually started living on Mars in 150 years. There's a great plan. Artificial intelligence will actually pervade tomorrow's world, and we will have robo will have vision, speech, and movement. Natural language processing is already again most of these things are actually coming into practice. If you talk to Google, for instance, and say, just open a mobile and say, which is the nearest restaurant, and actually answers you. So there is a lot that goes on. It recognizes your voice, then that voice is converted into text. So there is a natural language. Unlike COBOL, C, Java, which are the structured languages, there is a syntax, and only in that syntax you will give instruction. Here you're talking to, or Eliza, for instance, or any other. You're giving instructions in natural language, and the machine understands and then executes. So that is called a natural language processing. And there are several, on each there are complications. Machine learning. So this is wrongly written. Machine learning. It shouldn't be machine language. And there's unsupervised, supervised, and reinforced. Normally, you teach the machine, by the way. Earlier artificial intelligence had very limited scope when there was expert systems. Like in doctors, you have to feed. If the eyes are red and this is that, etc., then the diagnosis is conjunctivitis. Then you give that medicine and so on. So basically, they were all rule based. So if there else had to be fed in, but now you train the machine and give you example of deep learning. This is very important, and I can't have sort of time to explain ANN and CNN, artificial neural networks or convoluted neural network, CNN. But I'll give an example for you to understand what is going on today. Earlier, take example of Canada. Canada was ruled by French and British both. So there are portions of Canada which actually speak French, there are portions which speak British English. So each government document has to be translated into French and English both, and that used to take hundreds of people doing the same job. If some document is in French, converted in English to French, and hundreds of people just doing the same job tirelessly, and then that used to consume not just a lot of time but money, and then it was very boring kind of job. Then they thought, can't the machine do this translation? And then initially the whole idea of doing machine translation was feed the syntax. So what is a verb, what is a noun, in Marathi we call it karta, karma, kriya pad. So basically feed the grammar, rules of grammar to the machine, and then ask the machine to do the translation. This was the earlier thinking, and that failed miserably. All machine translations failed. Then suddenly somebody said, why can't we actually do the way children learn? Children, when they learn the language, we don't teach them syntax. We don't tell them this is a noun and this is a verb. Children just listen to you, the parents, or whosoever is around, and then understands and starts speaking. Simple. So then they wrote an algorithm to catch similarities between languages, and then derive rules and store them in the database. And then they fed one line in French, one line in English to that algorithm. It started deriving similarities and deriving rules. The algorithm was written in such a fashion to find the similarities and derive and store rules. When they actually gave several such lines and the algorithm got richer and richer, this is what we could call its training phase. So it got trained. Today, 98%, I'm told, I have to check this, but more than 90% certainly, of documents, large documents in Canada are automatically translated by this machine. The person who wrote the algorithm doesn't need to understand French nor English, because it is essentially capturing similarities and deriving, so this is interesting. And that deep learning is based on artificial neural networks. So how the brain works, the brain has various neurons and they're connected and disconnected all the time. So we actually are encouraged by neuroscience and understand how brain works, and based on that, we build various layers and so on. I don't like to go into that. It's a fascinating area, and I'm actually writing a book on this. But essentially, there are various layers that get connected and disconnected, and final layer actually gives you the result. That's how entire face recognition, by the way, is done by deep learning. So that's when you want to find out whether there's a criminal or not. So all the criminals, their faces are stored in the database, for instance, all thieves and murderers and whatever. The cameras that are there on the streets take photographs all the time, and at a tremendous amount of speed, that face recognition, is done and matched with millions of faces, and then you can find out this criminal is actually moving from this station to that station, and so on and so forth. I think this is going to be the entire driverless car. Now, how does the car recognize that there's a tree or there is something? So it has to understand, or the signal, whether the signal is red or green or amber or whatever. So this is something which is completely based on deep learning. So we have to understand what is happening today in the world, and that is, you must have heard the name data science. All those whose children, or sons or daughters want to do sort of aspire to become computer scientists, data science is the thing of tomorrow. And I've really drawn a diagram. There's a big data, and big data is based on data mining. AI, and I'll talk about that. AI is based on machine learning and deep learning. So if you know all those, you are a data scientist. So data scientist needs to understand AI, machine learning, deep learning, and big data and data mining. What is big data? There's a huge amount of data that is created today by sensors. The sensors are there in the refrigerator, microwave oven. So essentially, we're talking about IoT, Internet of Things, which essentially means smart homes, air conditioners. You've seen Amitabh Bachchan's advertisement of remote. He's somewhere and he wants to start an AC in his own house from such a distance. That is basically IoT, Internet of Things. There are sensors all around your home, and they're talking to each other, and that is they create data. Similarly, data is created through factories. That is called as IIoT, Industrial IoT. And then there is data of Facebook and WhatsApp and the messages and so on, and database of variety of credit cards and debit cards. All that is put together as big data. Now, what is the use of this big data? You do data mining and essentially draw conclusions from this big data. And I'll give an example. How data is used, and this is very important. Please understand.
Sir, just to, so we're running short of time, and we have 15 minutes for question and answers. So should we just finish this and move on to question and answers after the slide?
Okay. We can move now if you want.
We can finish the subject because you are already into this, and then because some people have questions, and then 7:30 we'll have to wind up. So I'm just
then let's start the question. That's okay.
So we can just have if you want to finish the slide, we can finish this.
No, it's not my wanting. It's what people want. So I think people want to ask questions. Let them ask questions.
So yes, we can have. I got a few questions lined up here. Rajesh, you want to have the question from your side, and then we can start from your with you personally, and then Anji.
Sir, namaste. First of all, thank you very much for accepting our request and addressing our forum with future technology what is coming in. And but more important was, I think your first part of presentation, which is of I think of great interest to most of the entrepreneurs who are listening, because people they want to have insight about to build better businesses, and I think you have built companies like L&T Infotech and then Patni Computers and Apar. So first of all, let me just thank on behalf of Chrysalis Entrepreneur Forum for addressing us and then giving us insight about management principle. And I think that personal management and strategic management was one of the most important aspects that we want to learn, because this is, and more than I think that the point which you told about the team building, because normally in our size of companies the HR department is always taking backseat, and we are always busy in meeting day-to-day requirements. So thank you very much for those great. I just wanted to ask you one question, that you have mentioned about that preparing outsourcing and in-house manufacturing. I mean, in your case, you were in IT, we are in manufacturing, but it is also equally important for our kind of industry. So, any specific way of working on this outsourcing, because that preparing that particular matrix is very critical. I have tried to prepare that, what to outsource and what to manufacture in-house. So any idea on that?
No, there's no specific rule. As I've said, you should concentrate on what you are good at. You should decide what you are good at and then concentrate on that. I mean, if you're good at building, for instance, the builders, then you should concentrate on that. I mean, so and be the best builder. That is the very important thing, rather than meddling into 5 other things and then making a mess. That is, so you decide what your core competency is.
Anything related to technology, like high technology products are to be manufactured in-house and low technology manufactured.
No, there's no general rule. I mean, if you are in a high-tech area, then decide. Again, there are high-tech means what? That is the whole question.
That differs from company to company.
That differs from company to company, and then you have to actually you have to understand how technology is going to change. So you essentially want to choose which technology you want to be in and so on.
Okay, right. Thank you very much.
Anything else?
We have Gurbu sir, this point of yours where you spoke about the fact that now when companies in America we're talking about with the 4.0 coming in, industry 4.0 coming in. So now they would be looking out for having things not outsourced from India and China, because that cost can be taken care of if 4.0 is fully in operation in America itself.
But that'll take 20 years. I mean, but it started now. It is.
So that is now there, and it will take 10, 15, 20 years or so for that.
The point I'm trying to make is that if you base your industry now, for instance, of taking some work from America and build your capabilities and build your factories, and maybe America will give you that work now. But you must know what the future is. Because the future is that America will take that work back and do that work with robots in America. So if you're banking completely on this, you're finished. See, that the entire thing is that the change is going to be so rapid. It's not going to take 50, 100 years. It's going to be 5, 10, 15 years. So your strategy has to be very, very rapidly changing. And unfortunately, a century ago, when Ford Motors started, it didn't have to change so rapidly. But today, your ears and eyes have to be with what's likely to happen, which is why I wanted to sort of stress on what is likely to happen in tomorrow's world, and then end with Industry 4.0 and what industries will actually survive, which will vanish, which was very important. And unfortunately, we had to stop. But I think let people read on their own. But it's very important that if you don't do this, you will perish.
I have one more question, which I have asked for at other places as well, but somehow I don't. What is your opinion, sir, about this China-US trade war, and is it really going to help we as an industrialist that some orders, whether related to IT or whether related to manufacturing, can be transferred to a country like us?
Here is my take. Essentially, as I've said, even if some work comes to India, in another 20 years' time, it will probably go. So all the people who take that work up for outsourcing should be very careful of building capability which can be used in domestic market or some other market as well. So I think we have to be all the time on our toes. So that's point number one. Point number two is, I think we are losing the entire. When China-America war was going on, right? Trade war was going on. It actually started heating up from 2010 onwards, right? India did not start preparing, and there's nothing to do with BJP Congress, both in fact, right? We don't have the infrastructure, and by infrastructure I don't mean only 6-lane highways or 8-lane highways. That is completely wrong. We don't have infrastructure in terms of education, healthcare, water, electricity, public transportation. Now, here is very important. Now that you ask me this question, please understand. South Korea, China, Japan, Europe, America, all these countries who have progressed spend a huge amount of money in healthcare, education, water, electricity, and so on and so forth. That is infrastructure. That's why China actually could get those many jobs. How could China just build so large factories? If you go to not just Wuhan or Shanghai or something, I mean, the kind of cities they've built is enormous. I mean, this is just unimaginable. The kind of supply chains that they've built is, you cannot even believe that they could do this. It's because the healthcare, education, and road. There's somebody near Delhi who gave an interview saying that because that person wanted to, when people started actually crushing Chinese toys and started throwing Chinese TVs from the galleries and so on, for a few days, he said, okay, let me now start building some, producing some products which instead of importing from China, I will start manufacturing. He set up a factory, and in a few days or weeks, he had to close it because there was no uninterrupted power supply. And then he became, in fact, a distributor of Chinese goods. And I was shocked. See, the point is, unless you build this infrastructure, you have educated workers who can be skilled. 30% people don't even read and write. The next 30%, 8th standard boy doesn't know how to solve equations, solve mathematics or second standard. We need to spend 6% of our GDP on education. We spend 3%. We need to spend 5% of our GDP on healthcare, and we spend 1%. That's why COVID is so bad. I mean, we have to be ashamed of ourselves. All these countries the government spend huge amount of money huge amount of money. Korea, sitting on the dining table, we give examples of South Korea and Japan, how they have progressed. We Indians are idle and so on. We Indians don't know how to work and we don't want to work, which is complete nonsense. If we had a very good infrastructure of education, healthcare, water, electricity, housing, and so on, which is what these countries did, we would have been extremely well prepared to jump into taking on the outsourcing and also then building capacity to use that, the developed skills too, for domestic market. Today, I don't know what will happen. I hope you get my answer.
But I think your recent
in fact, I must tell you that after the entire anti-China sentiment developed, and I have a lot of statistics because I'm interested in economics, because that will be a separate subject. Most of the business which actually came out of China went to Bangladesh and Vietnam. Most of it. We got, I think, 5-10%. The remaining went to these two countries and also some went somewhere else. So I think it's very important for you to understand why. Vietnam actually lost only 35 people in Corona. 35 people. Please understand. China also lost. Now this is moving around very freely. South Korea is a great example how to manage COVID. They had a huge, good infrastructure of healthcare, education, and so on, which is why they could do this. And COVID is another story, but I think important thing is that because of this, the Bangladesh is coming up extremely well. I mean, they've surpassed India in many areas, by the way.
Just one question. I mean, there are, I think, some questions also there, but just may I ask, Manish sir?
Please go ahead, Anji.
So there are again different elements in our country. There are politicians, then there are common people, and there is a fraternity like us, entrepreneur.
Yeah.
So what is your advice to entrepreneurs like us, that how should we build our businesses? Because alone government or alone some element will not make this happen, what you are saying. So our contribution is to build some businesses by which our people will grow and they will go to the next pedestal.
I've understood your question because of positive time. Sorry for interruption, but I must tell you that one of the reasons why entrepreneurs like you are not growing is that the governments, whether Congress, BJP, or whichever government, or even in America, or even in Britain, or whichever, are completely dominated by large corporates, and they don't want this infrastructure to be developed. And I'll have to take maybe a few hours to explain to you this. I've written a book called Anartha in Marathi.
I was referring to same book, sir. And
so please go through that book to understand that because government, there's a huge pressure of neoliberal philosophy to spend less and less on education, healthcare, and so on and so forth, which is why this infrastructure is not developed. Government does not spend on its research. See, how did America develop? There's an excellent book by Mario Mazzucato. The name of the book is Entrepreneurial State by Oxford economist. And that economist says that most of the research that has actually built American industries in pharma, electronics, and computers and so on was done by government sources. Most of the research that goes on in India also is TIFR and IITs and ISCs and NASA, ISRO and so on. In America, NASA and ARPANET and MIT and Stanford and so on. So please understand that they spend huge amount of money, the government spends, and then private people use that money to build products. She gives an example of Apple and several others. But in India, our research is far less. We spend 7 times more on advertisement, what shampoo to buy. So what can you do? So all of you should shout to the government that we should spend large amount of money on education, healthcare, water, electricity, housing, and research and development. We are very poor in terms of scientific papers and R&D and so on and so forth. Unless we do that, entrepreneurship will not grow.
Absolutely. Truly said, sir. This is I think this is the area which we don't know. We have no control over it, and it's only the governments which will take a call on it.
Yeah, but we should put pressure. That's
absolutely right, sir. So last question, which is being there for some time, and this is the question is traditionally we have been into services based on the technologies which have been developed by these advanced countries. So what do you see the future? Should we focus on the service side or should we focus on the product side in the years to come?
See, if you want to, as I've said, we should focus on both, but I think we should definitely develop the manufacturing capabilities. We are very, very poor in manufacturing. As you know, the IIP, if you see the way IIP has been, progressing, or in fact, not progressing, it's very bad. Because our GDP, the 70% of our GDP or 60% of GDP is services. In India, in terms of economic development, we bypassed industries. From an agrarian society, we now typically agrarian society moves to industrial, and industrial moves to services. And GDP comprises all these three, as you know, agriculture, industry, and services. But in India, because of the IT so-called revolution, suddenly we discovered that we are very good in IT and banking and so on. And then suddenly we moved from agriculture to services directly, bypassing the entire manufacturing. And I think to build that, we need an educated, healthy workforce, good power supply, water supply, housing. What China did, when they wanted to build a factory, they first built huge amount of housing initially to move the workers. So you have to have planning. Right? Today, how can we build manufacturing without this basis? That is the whole point, right? So we have to do that, and services, is very shaky in a sense. But we have to continue because we're good at IT, and good part is, in fact, I must tell you, thanks to Industry 4.0, thanks to cloud and big data and IoTs and AI and stuff like that, there'll be a lot of people, lot of IT and software people which will be required in the next 10, 20 years. Unfortunately, they'll be very small, a few lakh people maybe 1 crore out of 135 or 140 crores by then. But I think so it'll be a very small number in terms of employment. So it won't solve a problem. But that's where the new areas of growth will be. In terms of that can be outsourced, because that will be bread and butter for America. I mean, unless those systems are built, America will not be able to take over jobs there to sort of robots to do and all that kind of stuff, or 5G and stuff like that. I think, but the areas that will grow will be these. And also outsourcing will continue. I'm not saying it will vanish tomorrow. I'm just forecasting that in the next 20 years, we should be prepared that it might. And all will not go. I mean, maybe 50% will go, maybe 20%, 30, 40, 50. I don't know how many. And because of AI, World Bank has estimated 67% of the jobs will vanish. I don't think 67 will go, but many jobs will restructure, because, as I've said, there will be tremendous amount of obsolescence, right? When CAD/CAM came, the draftsmen were jobless. When ATM came, the teller clerks were jobless, and so on and so forth. With driverless cars, thousands and lakhs of drivers will be jobless. So I think the entire unlearning and learning and the job profile will change very rapidly. That's what I was going to speak about. So all people, even people who seek jobs or people who set up industries, will have to understand what the world is going to look like to be able to face. And that is what my rest of the portion was. But anyway, please read.
That's what people are not able to imagine, what the world would be.
That's about what's likely to happen. There's a lot of material available today, books and even articles and on the internet. Please read and be prepared for what's likely to happen. And unless you're prepared and just go through, agle 5 baras yahi hone wala hai. Maybe for 5 years it might continue, but you're in for a rude shock. Because I doubt whether the same thing will continue for 10 years in the same fashion. I mean, that is what I'm trying to tell you.
So we have the Facebooks in US, we have the Googles there, we have the Apple there. And we take pride in Infosys and Patni and companies like that, which are all service-based. So
yeah, we are not being able to build any product of our own.
So what exactly now? This is more or less a continuation of the previous part.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, I can't speak. The throat is probably just sort of gone bad. But I had written an article in Times of India as to why we can't produce a product. We have not been able to successfully able to write a product. Creating a product requires huge amount of investment. Creating SAP took years. You want to understand business of, and it's a generalized package. You're not a tailor-made package for a customer. You have to understand businesses of variety, hundreds of customers. You require business analysts and living in California or wherever, right? Or Europe. And it requires huge investment. Until 2000, I was not very critical of companies. But after 2000, most of the IT companies, the market cap was like billions of dollars. I mean, then why could they not do it? They could have set up an office in California, employ Americans, maybe Indians, maybe 300, 500 people, do business, maybe compete with SAP in the next 10 years. So I think, we have not just SAP, but several products, like Facebook. So we have been only sort of tell me what to do and I'll do what you want me to do. I mean, this is not, I won't call it IT superpower at all.
The power is now consolidating between, for example, you develop an app, so either it will be on Google platform or it will be on Apple platform.
Yeah.
So both will share the revenue. So you're actually having a business partner before even you have decided the product.
Right. Absolutely.
They will share 30% of your revenues.
Absolutely.
Of what you make.
Yeah.
So, that's how these. So, sir, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
We are very sorry that we had to.
No. It's not a personal this thing. I mean, it's just that
the loss is absolutely ours, and since this time paucity was there, and I am bound to stick to the time schedule. So I'm very sorry personally from my side.
That's fine.
Rajesh, you would like to conclude and from your side. Rajesh, you're on mute mode, Rajesh.
Yeah, again, it was my wish list that I was trying to get Mr. Godbole for our forum for many months, I would say, but somehow he was always busy. But because of this COVID, this online technology available, I thought that let me take one more chance and get Mr. Godbole and listen to his views, because I have read, I think, 10 of your books, sir, out of your 30. I haven't read all of them, but definitely Musafir was, as I wrote in my Facebook post and LinkedIn post, that it is the book for, I think, I personally feel that each and every entrepreneur should read that book, or I would say each and every living being should read that particular book, because you have lived, I think, many lives in one life. That is my personal opinion about Musafir. But of course, Boardroom and Kimayakar and Arthat, Manath, and of course I was little this thing about Anarth. I was feeling that are we heading in the right direction or not? And it is little scary book, I would say, if one reads in depth. It is you feel that as a country are we heading in the right direction or not? And that's the reason I asked the question that as an entrepreneurial fraternity, how can we contribute to nation growth and all? But so it was my real wish list that our forum members should listen to you, and I'm really thankful for accepting our request. Because of time constraint, as MG sir said, that we had to cut short and for that last question, but definitely we will get another opportunity to listen to you in the future, maybe when our in-person meeting starts after this COVID Corona days, and certainly we will try to grab that particular opportunity. And he has already informed me that his throat is not good, in good state, but despite that he accepted our request. So thank you once again, and it was really insightful lecture. There are many takeaways which we will definitely share in our forum after this lecture. We have process of sharing our views on your lecture, and probably we will try to share you what our other members thought of our lecture.
Sir, मैं आपसे ना personally जब मिलूंगा, when I'll meet you personally, sir, I have a personal question to have an answer for, and the question would be, how do you manage to keep yourself so young? So मैं आपसे personally
I have BP, diabetes. I have had an angioplasty. I'm 70. It is a hair dye that does the trick. Please understand.
The view on your face is so wonderful. It defies all the numbers behind you in terms of age sides. बहुत एक चेहरे पे अलग glow है. And so when you cleared your IIT, I was just 2 years of age. I'm thinking from that perspective. With so much, and you look so fresh and so energetic. And thank you so much. In spite of your bad throat, you managed to be here. We have wonderful feedback.
Yeah, thank you.
Are thankful to you, sir, for giving your time, valuable time to all of us here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Bye.
God bless you, sir. Thank
Bye.
you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you everybody for being there. All Chrysalis Anthrope members. Love you for that. You can give your feedback. You can write your comments on the chat box, and be a part of the mission which I shared about last Monday. Ab hamari bari hai, and I want to have your videos. I want to have your pledges downloaded. If you can share that on the social media, let's create this momentum. Let's create this energetic environment around us in the entrepreneurial world. हिलाते हैं entrepreneurs को, जगाते हैं उनको, और एक बार शेयर करते हैं उनके साथ दोबारा कि ये समय अब हमारा है as entrepreneurs to add in, to support, to make the nation move forward, क्योंकि अब हमारी बारी है. So बिल्कुल हिम्मत से काम लेंगे. Next 5 months, next 6 months, whatever of the financial year are left, सब धो डालते हैं पुराना 6 महीने का पाप जो भी है, और वापस टर्नओवर्स को लेके जाते हैं where it should be. So we'll cross our last year's financial turnovers in the next 6 months. इतना काम करते हैं, चलिए. And I've got some awesome feedback. Even Rajesh was sharing with me that we will go beyond our last year's turnover. So I'm expecting and I'm waiting to listen to your stories about how you went beyond your limitations to make the most of these next 6 months. So thank you so much, and God bless you all, and see you for the next meet when we meet again next month. Love you all.